My name is Lydia Kemunto Bosire. I am the CEO and founder of 8B Education Investments. We are a company that specializes in connecting African students with global opportunities, where to go to school, how to finance the education, and how to get a global job after that education. So I was born and raised in Kisii, Kenya, and then I finished class 8 in Kisii Primary School. I then went on to Loreto Limuru for my high school. After Loreto High School, I was really lucky to get a scholarship to the United World College of the Atlantic. It's called UWC Atlantic, and it's an international high school in the UK for 5th and 6th form. While at the UWC Atlantic, I got a subsequent scholarship to Cornell University in the US, where I studied government and international relations for my bachelor's, and I got a back-to-back master's in public affairs. So that was my first set of degrees that's the pathway of my education until my first set of degrees. So Kisii Primary School, Loreto High School, Limuru, after which I got a scholarship to the United World College of the Atlantic for my international baccalaureate. From there, I got a scholarship to Cornell University in the US. There I did a bachelor's in government, which is another name for political science, with a concentration in international relations. And then I did a master's in public affairs. After that, I worked for a few years, and then I went to Oxford for a master's in African studies and a doctorate in politics. That's my education. Initially, when I left Loreto to go to the UWC Atlantic, what surprised me is how well prepared I was for a rigorous education. One gets the impression that the Kenyan education system just isn't rigorous enough, and that's not true. I was very suited for the rigor of the education, and I was able to not only excel in classwork, but also do a lot of other leadership activities that are necessary when you're then applying on for university in the US. I found it to be true as well in the US that a Kenyan educated through the Kenyan system student entering a top US university like Cornell is absolutely well prepared. The kids in my class had not studied Shakespeare. In Loreto Limuru, I had. So I find that one of the biggest myths that is really worth dispelling is that we get a really good education. And I found that it served me very well. How did I fit in? With some difficulty, because I think coming from a convent school, high school, girls only, into a co-ed setting, which is what the United World College of the Atlantic was, where there is no Christianity or religion as a guide as to what behavior is acceptable and what's not, where there were students from 80, 90 countries. That was very different. And it was a moment to find myself, but also to gain pride in who I was, because when you're Kenyan, everyone around you is Kenyan until you go to a place where there's only two of you and everybody else is from everywhere else, and then you realize that there is just so much to be proud of. So it was a moment of self-discovery for me. I found Cornell to be similar. It was a much bigger place than my high school in the UK, and I found an international community, and I lived somewhere called International Living Centers. Then my identity was as an international student as opposed to an American student, and that was a wonderful experience. Cornell does a very good job. It has everything you can imagine. I was able to take advantage of so many activities they had. One of the things that I did while in Cornell was to start global AIDS advocacy platform for young people to advocate for inclusion in HIV/AIDS programs and policies. And that took me everywhere where young people were not, but where they should be, in order to make the case that nothing about us without us, which is a phrase you hear very commonly around the women's movement when women are wanting to participate and to be around the table as equals. That was a moment when for HIV we needed young people to be equals because they were the ones driving the pandemic, and Cornell gave me the space and the resources to do that. At the end of my first degree in Cornell, which I finished in 3 years, Cornell gave me, I continued with my master's in public affairs in Cornell. I had actually applied at the end of that first degree, the first 3 years, I applied for a master's in public health, an MPH program at the Harvard School of Public Health, because I was doing a lot of health activism and global health work. And they gave me an offer, which I was really excited about, because I thought the way to work with competence and with credibility in global health would be by having a degree in global health. They gave me an offer, but they gave me no money. And so I could not go. I stayed on in Cornell for that 4th year and got my MPA. After that, I went on to work at the International Center for Transitional Justice. This is an organization that was started initially by leading South African practitioners of accountability and justice after conflict or violence. And the founder was one of the senior people at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for South Africa. His name was Alex Borain. And I was so fortunate to work there because that work became relevant for Kenya when in the 2007-2008 season we had post-elections violence, and there was a lot of thinking about what does accountability need to look like. But I worked there after graduating Cornell, and then after that, one of the mentors that I had cultivated while I was doing global health activism called me up and said, I'm doing some work on global women advocacy. I need a consultant. Would you be open to it? That was not anything that I had studied. It's not anything I had done and I had experience around, but she knew my work around young people's participation, and she and I had maintained a relationship. So she called me up and she asked me to do this. So I left the International Center for Transitional Justice and went to the UN Population Fund. All of this was in New York in order to do this work for my mentor. I did that work and it morphed as work in international organizations do into whatever was happening at the time. And one of the big issues that was happening at the time is drawing lessons from the HIV/AIDS movement in order to figure out what needed to happen in the global movement for women's and children's health. And since I had worked in the HIV movement and I had worked on questions of agenda setting, I was drawn into that work, which means I was seconded to the World Health Organization in Geneva. So I did that work until, while I was doing that work, I was actually applying for graduate school. I have always been applying for graduate school ever since my offer and could not take, the offer I could not take back in Cornell, because I did want to get another degree that wasn't a Cornell degree, because let's face it, you face glass ceilings and you want to always make sure that the reason you're not getting the opportunity isn't an artificial reason that somebody can put on the table, like they don't have the right degree or at the right level. You always want to dispel that, and I always thought that education would remove those additional barriers. So while I was working, I was applying for graduate school, but I had never really received an offer with good funding. Finally, while I was at the World Health Organization in Geneva, I got an offer from Oxford for a master's in African studies that I had applied for. So I was thrilled. I said goodbye to my boss and off I went to Oxford. My boss at the World Health Organization, and I'll return to this because it's really important, relationship building and mentorship. I've already given an example that I ended up working at the UN Population Fund because a mentor who had actually become a friend called me up out of the blue and said, I have this thing and I think you're suited for it. And now I was leaving the World Health Organization. My boss wanted me to stay. There was a lot of work to do. We had just launched an initiative with the Norwegian Prime Minister around women and children's health. So what we were starting was really taking off. But I was also really keen that I had spent time educating my brothers and sisters. It was my turn to go back to school 5 years after Cornell, and so I left. But in really good terms, I continued doing some consulting work for her. Oxford was a wonderful place. Oxford I would wish Oxford on anyone. The first thing you feel when you get there is that every little corner of the African continent has been studied in a manner that makes everybody near you an expert on something, and you almost feel like, but I come from there, like how are you the expert on this thing that I've actually not even heard about? Because sometimes you take so for granted what's around you because you're in it, and it was such a suitable place for the academic exploration that I was seeking. This was around 2007, 2008, around the time when Kenya then fell into some conflict as a result of the election then. And so I very quickly found myself adding Kenya into my spaces of study, just because issues that were never quite relevant were becoming relevant here. Or not relevant, issues that had never been on top of the agenda were suddenly on top of the agenda as a result of what happened in the elections and the violence that followed and how that was managed. So I was at Oxford at the time. I finished my master's in African Studies. I transitioned on to a doctorate in politics. I was thrilled to get the offer because you have to apply. It's not automatic that you can finish a degree and get on to the next one. I was thrilled to get the offer, but I realized that the Clarendon scholarship that had covered my master's could not cover my PhD. So I changed colleges. My advisor at the time was an excellent professor who also has done a lot of research in Kenya and understood that nobody has, that many pounds in their pocket to pay Oxford to continue with an education. For funding not to be there is a big problem. So we twisted ourselves into a pretzel. I changed from one college to another because I had matriculated into one college, but that college had no money. I went into another college that had a bit more money, but then I had to work for some really, the diplomatic word would be an unusual Canadian philanthropist in London, and took up on a bunch of consultancies to make that work because I needed to make it work. I could not continue to the PhD, to the doctorate. They call it the DPhil. So to do the DPhil, I had to make all these things work. So I stayed on to do my doctorate, and I was looking at the instrumentalization and politicization of international law and human rights in African political contexts, and I looked at Kenya and Uganda. As I was finishing that work of the field work, and I did that in both Kenya and Uganda, my boss at the World Health Organization, the woman who had wanted to keep me, and I said, no, it's my turn to go to school, so I'm leaving, called me up, and the work that we had started doing on women's and children's health advocacy was taking off. The Gates Foundation had put their weight behind it, and the Secretary General's office in New York was going to take leadership in stewarding a campaign on women's and children's health. And she asked whether I wanted to take a job in the Secretary General's office in New York, seconded by the World Health Organization, to which I said, absolutely, I have just finished all my field work, I'm now going to start writing. I could definitely use something in New York. And so I left. I was Kenya, Uganda, finished that, went to Geneva, was onboarded to the work, and then left for New York. Worked on the launch of what became Every Woman, Every Child. It's a global initiative that continues today. And then I moved on to the UN Population Fund, where I had been before, but now working with the new Under Secretary General, a wonderful Nigerian gentleman, Babatunde, who was managing the implementation of the thing that the Secretary General had launched, of that initiative. So I worked with him for some time until it was the first year of implementation had been successfully announced. At that time, I was applying for positions in the UN Secretariat, positions that were more political than development, because now I was working in global health, which I loved, but I was doing my doctorate in politics, and so I wanted to do more political work. And then I took on a position shortly after finishing the work at UN Population Fund, took on a position at the UN Secretariat in New York at the Department of Political Affairs. And that's where I have been until I left to start 8B. So that's not quite accurate. I worked between the Department of Political Affairs and the World Bank's office or group that works on fragility and conflict. When I started at the Department of Political Affairs, working with the World Bank was something that, we went for a meeting once in a while and everybody found it exhausting and unproductive. And I steered that file to be a really meaningful file where we ended up doing the first joint study between the UN and the World Bank on conflict prevention of its kind. So intrapreneurship, the idea of sitting in places that are very serious bureaucracies and still managing to get through the kinds of things that I wanted to see, is something that I found myself doing a lot. One of the recurring stories of my experience was receiving opportunities for education and not being able to finance them. So initially from Cornell, when I was looking at public health, I got an offer from Harvard. They didn't give me any money. Later, when I was doing my doctorate at Masters in Oxford, had to really work around great difficulty to get it financed eventually. But I'm the kind of person who has applied for every scholarship that is out there because of the wanting to further my education. I've applied for the Chevening, I never got it. I never got the Commonwealth. I never got any of those scholarships. And it wasn't for lack of trying. And what I realized was that one of the biggest bottlenecks for African brilliance having a global impact is financing. We get to all these places, we get all these offers to great universities, but we don't have the money to go there. That was one lesson of my experience. The second lesson of my experience is that I was really lucky to work in all these spaces that I really wanted to work in, and was doing the kind of work that I wanted to do, but was acutely aware of how few people looked like me and had my lived experience in those rooms. And the reason they were not there was not because they couldn't be there, but it's because they were not in the universities from which we recruit for the people who end up running global policy, and in fact any other sector that intersects with decision making. I find that there are very, very few Africans, and the reason they're there is that they're not in Columbia and Cornell where we're recruiting. Those experiences made me ask the kinds of questions that led me to the way we unblock the African access to these spaces. The way we enable more Africans to be in all these spaces is by enabling financing for African students who are going to global universities. That led me to start 8B. 8B is a company that exists to connect brilliant, ambitious young Africans to the global opportunities that might be out there for them, using education as the entry point. So we connect students with information about universities. Students can get information from agents, from Google, from a variety of places. If they can complement all of those searches by coming to hb.africa, and they will find impartial, nobody is paying us for the information that is there. It is all there because of the collective wisdom of the Africans that we know who would have found this information useful. Critically, we connect African students with financing. We have launched the first student financing marketplace for African students going to global universities. That means two things. You will get a comprehensive scholarship database on our platform, but once you've shaken every scholarship tree and every free dollar has fallen and you still have a financing gap, we want to make sure that if you want to get an affordable loan to go to your education, you can be able to find that through our marketplace. So we have curated affordable loans for people from lenders whom we know can lend to African students, and all that information is in one place. Again, you can go to Google, you can go to a variety of other places and spend 10 times the amount of time to get to this information, but we've done the work for you so that it's there. You get scholarship financing. If that's not enough, you can apply for affordable loans. The last thing that we do in this three-part end-to-end solution is to enable the students who are in global universities to have shoulders to step on as they are in their professional search. And in addition to mentorship, we have on our jobs marketplace the kinds of opportunities that employers have told us they would like to fill with African talent. So we encourage anybody who is either an ambitious African student who is interested in a global career or knows such persons to go to our website and see what we have pulled together from employers and see whether in fact there is an opportunity for them there, and then we can match them up with existing opportunities. So that's what we've built, connecting African students with universities, connecting students with the financing they need to afford those universities, and with the jobs they need to succeed. That's what HB does. Advice that I would give to women that are out there, working hard is something that Kenyan women do. So I don't have to say, hard work pays off, but hard work truly pays off. Because when you work really hard, you are then very prepared for any kind of serendipity that might come your way. But the second lesson I would say is be open to opportunities and serendipity, because that's how doors are opened. And one becomes more ready for that by taking relationship building seriously, taking networking seriously. My opportunities, the kind of luck that I have had, has been really would never have been possible. It's impossible to replicate, and would never have been possible if it wasn't for so many people that I had a relationship with, or I had worked with and kept a good interaction with even after working. All without exception, all my opportunities have been from relationships, including after I left the UN and was starting HB, getting introductions to investors and who is going to open which doors, and all that comes from relationship building. So when people say network, relationship build, they literally mean you don't go to an event to do that. It's an everyday practice. Who are the two people in the course of today that you have lost touch with, that you would find something really interesting that makes you think of them, and you should reach out to them as a result of that? How are you giving to the relationships in your life? Because it's not automatic and obvious who are the people who might open doors for you. It happens in very unusual ways. And that is something that has been so humbling for me to realize. And no amount of, having been so lucky to have the right education and work in so many well-known and respected institutions, none of that substitutes for the relationships that one has and that open doors. So that's, I would really encourage people to take relationship building very seriously.